You're listening to Rethinking Trade with Lori Wallach.
Small business owners and farmers are protesting the Korean
WTO and NAFTA are transnational forms of autocratic governance
Few
that
moments I will
subordinate
sign
our
a
own.
North American free trade agreement.
Seattle has never seen anything like it.
Mexican workers face threats of violence.
Trade policy has delivered one punch in the gut after another.
Welcome back to Rethinking Trade, where we don't just talk about trade policy, we fight to change it. I'm Ryan, and I'm joined once again by our in-house trade expert, Lori Wallach. So, Lori, 2 weeks ago we ran through day one and first 100-day suggestions for the Biden administration on how to fix our rotten trade policies. Today we're going to jump into the longer-term changes laid out in the recent Transition Memo on trade policy that Public Citizen and the Carpenters Union put together. For the listeners, you should definitely check out part one as well, but here's part two. Lori, are you ready to answer some questions?
I am.
So, like last time, I'm going to read the headline from this document for each of these policy proposals. You're going to have about 1 minute to explain it to our listeners. When you hear the buzzer, it means your time is just about up. You ready to go?
I am.
All right. Part two, number one. Conduct an inclusive, comprehensive, transparent process to review existing trade agreements for consistency with the Build Back Better plan.
So that's kind of self-explanatory. The point is that many terms in our existing trade agreements have nothing to do with trade per se, but rather conflict with the climate and health and economic justice focus of the Build Back Better plan. And it's things as diverse as the ban on buy local or buy American procurement, which is used to reinvest our tax dollars into developing new EV, electric vehicle technology, or renewable energy sources domestically. It is rules against subsidies that could stop the government from investing in making more medicine domestically. It is rules about standards that could basically require us to import goods that are climate dangerous and not be able to distinguish. And so all of that stuff needs to be reviewed, needs to be fixed, so our trade agreements support, not undermine, the whole wide set of non-trade goals that are in the Build Back Better plan.
Number two, launch a review of USMCA implementation to develop an action plan around labor and environmental rules.
So the revised NAFTA, which Trump called the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, had some improvements on paper, but a lot of it still is not implemented. And there are a lot of powerful interests and elite players in the governments of the three countries that may or may not be interested in implementing all of it. So it's really important that the people and planet parts of that agreement, the labor standards, the environmental standards, water quality, etc., that a plan to make sure that stuff is actually translating from paper to improvements on the ground is created and then enforced. And that's everything from cracking down on those border maquiladora plants where workers are being forced to go back to work without COVID protections in Mexico, where unions are still being busted, to making sure that the investment of water improvement funds and environmental cleanup money actually goes to where it's supposed to be.
All right, off to a good start again. Number three, establish a position at the National Security Council focused on U.S. supply chain resilience.
So the idea here is we need an all-government focus on rebuilding domestic supply chains and also diversifying the sources of imports for critical goods. The COVID-19 crisis made clear to every American, here we are in the richest country in the world, and we can't get basic stuff. I mean, we can't get the medical stuff like masks and enough medicine, which in itself is a crisis, but we can't get basic stuff so that if one country in a long, hyper-globalized, thin supply chain were to make, one product of food or one electronic product, you have to have the pieces only made, each one in one country of 50 countries, and one country goes down because there's sickness, could be a natural disaster next time, the whole thing falls apart. Can't have that. And this was a real lesson. And so we need coordinated plans to rebuild our resilience and to build stronger supply chains.
Number 4, implement the Build Back Better, Buy American, and other domestic preference program reforms.
So this is really actually extremely urgent. This is both a longer term project where our new US trade representative will need to be negotiating with other countries to take back the policy space for how we use our taxpayer dollars in procurement that was given away in agreements like the WTO and NAFTA and CAFTA. Right now, we have to treat the goods, the services, the companies from 60 other countries as if it was Buy American. So Buy American now means the US and 60 other countries. So that needs to get fixed because that's in the terms of agreements that need to be renegotiated. And President Biden has said he wants to renegotiate those so we, but also our trade partners, can use their tax dollars as a tool to develop their own economies and innovate and invest in their own people. But in the short term, the president needs to immediately waive, with respect to the emergency trillions of dollars for COVID relief and recovery, these limits that make us basically break Buy American. Otherwise, instead of stimulating our economy, instead of starting to invest in being more resilient at home, that money's just going to get offshored. And there's no conditions on labor standards or environmental or human rights conditions. So it could mean our tax dollars go to invest in, goods made in horrible human rights conditions in China or in plants that have busted unions in Mexico. So this is both a short-term and a long-term problem.
Number 5, launch a review process to formulate a new U.S. position on digital trade.
So digital trade is the corporate brand that the big tech firms have given to trying to use trade agreements to impose worldwide limits on the regulation of the big tech platforms. And some very bad rules like that are in the revised NAFTA, and in an agreement with Japan that the U.S. pushed. But also they're being pushed at the World Trade Organization for the whole world. And the U.S. has been one of the leaders in pushing for these rules that basically mean governments can't regulate for our consumer data privacy, something that's a huge problem in the U.S. and in many countries, but the U.S. is way behind everyone else. It means that we can't get rid of the liability waiver that right now means things you buy online, Amazon and other companies, pretend that they have no product safety liability. So if the product kills you, you could sue a store, but you can't sue them. They pretend they're not the buyer. They pretend the seller. They pretend they're just a communications platform. And also a lot of problems around discrimination based on the algorithms that the companies use so that white people are offered information on better jobs and Black people get less information on good housing. All of those kind of rules we have to have a new approach to because we need to regulate big tech, not let them use trade agreements to basically abuse people worldwide.
Number 6, implement new U.S. Trade Representative transparency standards.
So it's not so much the USTR per se, but rather the whole agency. Historically, there has been a lot of behind closed doors negotiation and secret information. And these negotiations are making policy on things that affect all facets of our everyday lives. But unlike, say, the Freedom of Information Act, where you can get government documents, or the Government in the Sunshine Act, where meetings have to be open, there's a lot of secretive stuff that happens in trade that is just inappropriate given what today's trade agreements are meddling in, from access to medicines to food safety to where our tax dollars go. So we need to actually have a much more open process so that people not only can get access to the information and know what the government is doing ostensibly on our behalf, but also so that we can have more of a means of giving input of what we want. Right now, there are 500 official advisors who are cleared to see the secret documents, have special access, and almost all of them are corporate. That can't stand.
Number 7, work with Congress to update trade preference programs, including the Generalized System of Preferences, or GSP, and an early reauthorization of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA.
So, in addition to trade agreements, the U.S. has what are called trade preference programs. And these are statutory programs that set terms for special, better access into the U.S. market for developing countries that are better tariff, lower tariff rates, for instance, that are included in our global WTO commitments. And the idea with these programs is they should be development programs. And they need to have conditions that are pro-development for what a country has to do to get these special market access rights. Unfortunately, over time, the agreements haven't kept up to the transformation in trade policy. So GSP has some labor standards, but they're pretty weak. And the African Growth and Opportunity Act has a variety of conditions you wouldn't want to impose on countries if you're trying to help them develop. And in both instances, the programs need to be updated to basically put people and planet standards in place. But also with the African Growth and Opportunity Act, it needs to be reauthorized early because President Trump was running around to African countries threatening it would go away and they better sign up for a whole free trade agreement or else, which really isn't in their interest or ours.
Number 8, work with the Treasury Department to require all foreign private sector, sovereign wealth fund controlled, or state-owned enterprises seeking to list on U.S. capital markets to meet all transparency standards to which U.S. domestic firms are subject.
Okay, so that was a mouthful, but what that boils down to...
That almost took me a minute.
What that boils down to is this scam, which is the Treasury Department has been waiving the requirements, particularly for a state-owned enterprise means just literally that, a government-owned firm. There are a lot of Chinese state-owned enterprises, but also some, it's not inherently a problematic thing. The U.S. government port authorities are like a state-owned enterprise, but there are a lot of commercial ones that aren't running services, like the Tennessee Valley Authority is a state-owned enterprise, but it's a government service. But the ones that are competing in trade from other countries and sovereign wealth fund, that's government money that is investing as if it were a private investor. They're allowed to go to the stock markets, which is what a capital market is, so to the New York Stock Exchange, without meeting all of the normal requirements that a U.S. firm would be subject to. And what this has caused is these real conflicts where Saudi Arabian state-owned enterprises and sovereign wealth funds and others from the oil-producing nations and Chinese state-owned enterprises are buying up U.S. firms that might have a security concern with such ownership, or countries with really horrific human rights reputations are buying up sensitive firms, and we don't know. And or they're getting money on the capital markets without us knowing. So something's being listed and we're having U.S. stock buyers put money into it and make it powerful, and we don't know who it really is.
Number 9, direct the Department of Commerce to declare that China is not a market economy.
So this is another kind of wonky thing, but it's actually has a lot of repercussions. How U.S. domestic trade policy works with respect to different trade cheating remedies, like dumping stuff on the U.S. market below the price of production. That, and also how a country is treated at the World Trade Organization, has to do with whether or not a country is considered a market economy. If you're a market economy, you get kind of treatment the US, Canada, Brazil, India, Japan, Korea, South Africa get. But if you're not a market economy, i.e., you have a lot of government intervention, a lot of government funding, so, a country like China, then you are treated with, I would say, more wariness about what's a subsidy and what isn't, what's fair trade and what isn't. And so it's going to make a big deal for U.S. jobs and for U.S. companies, especially those that are going to try and create some new U.S. investment in things like electric vehicles and battery storage and new materials, the cutting edge industries, that it's clear China's not a market economy and they need to be treated that way. And China's been making a lot of threats about if countries don't declare them a market economy, they're going to do this or they're going to do that. And so far, all the world's countries have stuck together and said, if you're a market economy, you are, but you're not, so you're not. And that should stay the current position.
All right, we are at the final one, number 10. don't continue with business as usual with respect to publishing a national trade estimates report that includes lists of other countries' environmental, food safety, health, and other public interest protections identified as, quote, illegal trade barriers.
So every March 1st, the US government comes out with a report called the National Trade Estimates. It sounds like innocuous. It's not. It's a country by country report where in the course of the year leading up to it, US industry is invited to offer things that they think are unfair trade practices of other countries. And they get listed in an official government report of things these other countries better get rid of. And so the problem is it ends up being a list of, there are some real trade problems in there, like subsidies or, things that act like a quota, a limit on imports that aren't health or safety related. And they're honest to God protection. But the vast majority of what is in this report is just targeting the environmental, health, worker safety, food safety, product safety, and other public interest protections that other countries have. That will, if the U.S. product has GMOs and the country requires labeling if it comes in. If it's not labeled, it can't come in. If another country, for instance, bans the use of chlorine washes, basically crappy chicken that literally has feces on it, dipped in chlorine, which is how our system works versus making sure it's clean on the front end. If it can't come in, it can't come in. If other countries will not, for instance, store computer data through the US because we don't have any privacy protections and we're not considered safe for that, all right, then so be it. As long as it's not discriminatory, it shouldn't be on a trade shit list. And that is what that National Trade Estimates list has become. And instead, it should focus on where there are real trade problems, where there's actually a benefit for US workers to fixing real trade cheating and not become a hit list of other countries' domestic policies that our companies don't like because some product they make can't be sold there.
Good work, Lori. I think you got 50% of them in under a minute. And again, folks should check the link in the summary of this episode or just go to tradewatch.org and you can see the transition memo on trade policy.
And for all the fun that Ryan and I are having about my trying to say what this means, each of these bullets in 1 minute, it's worth reading the memo because it does spell out a roadmap to how we could have a U.S. trade policy taking the opportunity of an incoming administration that seems keen to change some things to actually try and have policies that put people on the planet as a priority.
Rethinking Trade is produced by Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. I would encourage you to visit rethinktrade.org as well as tradewatch.org to educate yourself and to find out how you can get involved in the work we're doing to fight for fairer and more equitable trade policies.